Hi, AP students. This is our third installment here of, as you can see, our 2017 multiple choice questions. 20 more here. If you haven't gone through the first two, you don't have to do those first necessarily, but they are some good practice on how, some different strategies on how to solve these things. So excuse maybe some mistakes I may make. I'm trying to do this in one take. So anyway, off we go. Let's get started here. Number one, we're starting out with, it's asking us, what is an indicator of an impending recession? So really, at the end of the day, we've got to remember that a recession means that aggregate demand is going to decrease. Okay. So when we have that demand decrease, which one of these is best going to um, affect the inventories of businesses? Well, inventory is just a fancy way of saying like how much stuff is on our shelves, right? So the best answer is our inventories are going to increase because no one's buying them due to that decrease in consumption in that particular case. Again, that household consumption, if you want to get technical about GDP, that is what we're trying to tie into as well. Okay, so again, the recessions happen due to a decrease in demand, okay, not supply, and they're not going to remain constant. So think about it as people stop buying stuff, and so the shelves get packed, so to speak. Who's going to benefit from unexpected inflation? Let's review our equation here. So our equation is referred to as the Fisher equation, okay? And if you turn my little mnemonic device here, if you turn this H into an N, it gives me a fish or a Fisner, so to speak. And that helps me remember that my nominal interest minus my expected interest equals my real interest rate. Okay, so remember, borrowers, you and I are going to be affected by this real interest rate. And if we have a negative interest rate, benefits borrowers. Okay, so that means a positive affects borrowers. Okay, that means a positive is going to affect lenders. Okay, so let's just start out with like, um, this number being like 5, whatever. So let's say nominal is 7, and this is kind of how you can walk yourself into an interest. So let's just say nominal is 7 and expected is 7. So that's going to make our real inflation. Everybody breaks even. So notice we have some unexpected deflation, all right? So if we have deflation here, this number is going to go down. We can even say that it becomes negative, so to speak, all right? But let's just say that it goes down. So we go 7 minus, let's call it 4, all right? And that's going to equal 3. That number is a positive number. That's not negative. That doesn't benefit borrowers, okay? So again, keeping in mind that deflation is going to cause our wages to go down, and as we pay loans, we pay the same amount of money each month. That's what that's trying to get you to understand. But that equation, if you can remember that Fisher equation, NER, okay, it's going to be good for a couple points during the exam, including one coming up here a little bit later. Full employment equilibrium, consumers and firms become more optimistic. Which of the following is going to occur? Okay, so more optimism is going to lead to more willingness to buy stuff. And that might mean borrow money too. Um, More optimism, though, is going to affect our aggregate demand. And it's going to shift our aggregate demand over to the right. All right. And so when we know that, that's going to increase our price level, increase our GDP, our output. All right. Our aggregate demand shifts right. We've got two options of shift, or actually three options of shifting right. But again, if you can draw this graph, we know that price level goes up, GDP is going to increase, and we can also tie in that unemployment is going to decrease. And I haven't read the entire answers yet. We know that unemployment is going to go down as well. It could ask us that. All right, but we know increasing output, increasing the price level, That's our best answer there. Again, drawing those graphs, we know what is going to happen in those particular cases. All right, when we can draw the graph. Demand curve for money shifts to the right. Our demand curve for money is going to shift to the right when we start consuming and producing more stuff. So I'm going to use this same graph here. We're going to start buying more stuff. Well, anytime we start buying more stuff, that means we're going to borrow more money. Again, as businesses rush to start businesses due to the higher demand for output, things like that, going to lead to the again making us want to borrow more money. Okay, so this is giving us the Phillips curve here. It's also talking about the aggregate demand curve. Let's kind of start over where we're at because, again, we've got to remember, first of all, we're going to draw the Phillips curve first. Here's our short run Phillips curve. It doesn't ask us about the long curve. I'll ignore that for now. Inflation, unemployment. All right. And then we'll give our aggregate demand, short run, aggregate supply also, just because I saw the answers, the potential answers of what we might need. So we've got an increase in both the inflation rate and unemployment rate can be illustrated by what? Okay, so we need an increase in inflation and an increase in unemployment. All right, which means over here we would need to have this happen and this happen. Remember, we can use employment as this bottom axis here, but we always label it GDP. This is our price level. So we've got to have an increase in both. Okay, so how do we get an increase in each of these particular graphs? Well, we've got to get to a dot right here, or we've got to get to a dot right here. We can decrease our aggregate supply to get there, or we can shift our short run Phillips curve to the right. Let's see what our options are. Okay, movement along, that's not right. That movement along here is, again, that's the trade-off between the two. So that's no good. Rightward shift of the short run Phillips curve, absolutely. That's going to show us what we have to do. Leftward shift of the nope, we know it's not leftward shift of the short run Phillips curve. Rightward shift of aggregate demand, that's not what we're drawing. Leftward shift of aggregate demand, nope, that's not what we're drawing. So you can walk yourself into that answer by being able to show those graphs to yourself. All right, this question is giving you kind of a lot of information that, and some of it you really don't need. Okay, so what we're looking for is we're looking for the balance of the current account. Remember, current account is going to be imports and exports. Financial account is going to be assets. All right, so it only asks us what's the balance of the current account, in this case, billions of dollars for this particular period. Well, our current account only means exports and imports. That's all we need. Okay, if we export more than we import, well, that means we're bringing more money in than we are spending overseas. So all you got to do is take this 400 minus 330. That gives us 70. That's your answer. Okay, try not to overthink too much there. Short run, tight monetary policy tends to cause a again, we can let's draw a tight money policy first. Tie it all in there. And if you haven't been trusting me on drawing these graphs over the last few videos, might be a good chance to get in the habit, even if I don't draw them very clear all the time. All right, interest rate, quantity. All right, let's draw it. So we got a tight money policy. Boom. We got a decrease in the supply of money. We got our interest rate going up. All right, let's see what happens. We've got an increase in the interest rate. We know that, again, private investment is going to refer to like businesses investing. If the interest rates go up, they can't borrow as much money to invest. On top of that, too, all right, we could think about private investment as like buying, like, I don't know, other types of investment besides the banks. Well, I might, since that interest rate goes up, I might start saving some money in a bank too. If you want to tie your brain around that. But easiest way is just we're going to increase our interest rate. And again, private investment is eventually referring to that aggregate demand curve, right? And it's eventually going to cause this. All right, it's going to make our aggregate demand go down. That's what it's asking you. All right, required reserve ratio 10%. Maximum change is the maximum change in the money supply. So what I've seen is in these questions, I've seen the term maximum change and I've seen the term immediate change in money supply for these types of questions. When it says maximum change, it's going to make us apply our multiplier to what we're trying to figure out. All right, so in this particular case, let's just figure out our multiplier first. So our multiplier is going to be 1 over the reserve requirement, which in this case is 1 over 0.10, all right, which equals 10. Our multiplier is 10. All right, let's not forget that. Now we're going to use that percentage again here in a second, all right, because I just had this person, John, deposited 50,000. So of that 50,000, right, 10% equals 5,000, which means that the bank can make new loans of 45,000. Right? It's still got to keep this 5,000 in reserve. It can't loan that money out. Now, again, the maximum amount of the change in the money supply, okay, which means that's the entirety of banks being able to loan this out. You have to apply the multiplier. So that multiplier 10 times 45,000 is going to give you that 450,000. All right. 45,000 is probably a common answer. Again, if it's asking you what is the immediate change or the amount of new money that this bank can loan out, you're correct at 45,000. If it was asking you what's the immediate change in the money supply of the M1 money supply, you could say minus 5,000. That's not an option, but that might be a number that you kind of get into your, I'm sorry, you could say 50,000, which definitely isn't an option because John takes that money out. That was a question we had. Sorry, I got mixed up. We did in class one day. All right, what can cause a recession? Well, recessions, all right, are caused by decreases in demand. So what's going to cause our decrease in aggregate demand? Or I'm sorry, it just asks us. We just got to remember this is just a fact that we know. All right, what's going to happen? How are we going to be able to draw that recession, a decrease in aggregate demand? Okay, so for number 10 here, it's asking us about basically what it's trying to get us to show that we know is it's trying to get us to remember our unemployment rate. So our equation for unemployment is the unemployed divided by the labor force. Labor force equals employed plus unemployed. And that's the tricky part, okay? We forget to do that sometimes. So if I really don't know the answer, I can have this memorized. I can know off the top of my head that when the number of discouraged workers increase, I can know off the top of my head exactly what's going to happen. So let's just kind of do some quick math here. So let's just start out with, let's say that we have 3 unemployed people and 10 in our labor force. Okay, so I can walk myself into this answer and not have to memorize this stuff. And so that's going to equal 30%, whatever, right? I'm showing my work here. Now, if we increase discouraged workers, okay, they are not in the labor force. Okay, they're not in, they're out. So discouraged remember means that some people left. All right. So if some people left, let's just say one of these people, this discouraged people, okay, this unemployed person, okay, they're discouraged. So they say, well, you know what, I'm going to go home and I'm not going to start working. So that changes how many people are unemployed because they're no longer looking for work. It also changes our labor force. All right. Well, 2 divided by 9 equals 20 equals 22.2%. All right. And that unemployment rate went down, obviously. Okay, remember, our labor force participation rate is the number of people that are in the labor force divided by the population, right? And so if we have this particular case, let's just say we had 10 people in our labor force over 20, okay? Well, if we have somebody leave this labor force, right, it's now 9 over 20. That's also going to decrease our labor force participation rate. So you can kind of walk your you can kind of walk yourself into some answers, even though you may not have these definitions memorized. That's one way that you can do it. By all means, you can also memorize this stuff. That's not necessarily how I'm always able to approach when I take these types of tests. All right, what's going to increase our aggregate demand? Interest rates aren't going to do it. We won't be able to borrow as much money. Oil supply, that's going to be decreasing our supply. Open market purchase, open market buying of government bonds by the central bank. Buy means bigger. All right, that's going to lower interest rates in our money supply. Reduction of pay and benefits for government employees. Well, that's decreasing demand. And decreasing the wealth, that's going to decrease our demand also. So we got a pretty obvious answer if you're able to keep those things straight. All right, so this is asking us basically, it's trying to figure out the value of a dollar based on potential inflation. Okay, so it's giving you a choice. In this case, Arthur has the option of saying, okay, I can get $1,000 today, or I can get $1,050 next year. Well, if I get 50 extra dollars next year, that's going to be a 5% increase in how much money I get. Now, it's asking you to tie that into inflation. Well, if inflation is 5%, I break completely even, right? The amount of money I get doesn't matter. All else considered, right? I mean, obviously, you might have some other factors like, well, maybe I'd rather have, like, if you're a junior in high school, well, I'd rather have that 1,050 in college because I'm going to need that more than I do right now, right? So taking that part of the equation out of the matter, right? We're just looking at complete dollar value. All righty. So again, you want to tie that into inflation. Pretty straightforward as long as you know how to figure out this percentage, which the fraction should be 50 over 1,000. It'll give you 5%. All right, we've got long run equilibrium. What's the long run effect of an increase in aggregate demand? Okay, so they're not super clear in telling you what to do. All right, so we're in long run equilibrium here. All right, and we got long run ag supply, short run. This is asking you again, usually we see this worded with the idea that the government's not going to get involved. So we've got an increase in aggregate demand, long run. Okay, so usually we get an increase in aggregate demand. It's going to say, hey, listen, what type of policy is the Federal Reserve, the central bank, going to do, or what type of policy is the federal government going to do, fiscal or monetary policy, right? So in this case, though, if the government does nothing, remember, in the long run, the problem here is that price level, in this case wages too, right, are going to increase. As those wages increase, short run aggregate supply is going to start decreasing back to the left. Hopefully you're remembering this concept. And we're always going to bounce back to this long run equilibrium point where all three once again match up. Okay, we're always going to come back to that. So what we know is in the long run, that price level is going to go up. Unemployment isn't going to necessarily change, okay, in the long run. So initially, unemployment goes down. Inflation definitely doesn't go down because we have an increase in demand. We know price level goes up. We're not going to decrease aggregate supply long run. We're not going to increase the money supply. That would make our aggregate demand even further to the right, making inflation worse. We know that an increase in the price level is eventually going to bounce back that way. If that answer were to say short run, increase in inflation, decrease in unemployment, we could say that. All right, if a foreign financial investor no longer sees country A as a safe haven, meaning I can't put my money there, what's the most likely going to occur in the short run? Okay, well, again, for whatever reason, this particular person is putting money into our economy. It sounds like they were investing it, right? So let's just use the US economy as an example. We've got the demand by foreigners, let's call them F. We've got the supply by the US. All right, so anyway, we've got the value over here, foreign over US dollars. You can label it however you wish. You don't need the graph anyway. But I am going to draw this decrease in demand here because now no one wants to put US dollar, or no one wants to invest in my currency. It's going to go down. Our fancy word is depreciate. And there you have it. Okay. Countries A, currency will depreciate. We don't know if we're going to work towards our current account's not going to necessarily work towards a deficit. Our financial, it's actually going to do the opposite because we're taking money out of the financial account, and so we're actually going to move towards negative. Remember, so if we were completely even, right? So if we were completely even here, where country A was, here's capital, here's financial, right? Exports, imports. If we were completely equal, which means we're completely equal here, right? Well, we're taking inflows out. All right, so we're taking the inflows out. So that turns us into negative. Okay, and so now we're going to have a negative inflow. Okay, so deficit. And it's going to move us towards a surplus in our current account. Okay, so we could draw that if we wanted to. You might want to, just to kind of prove your answer incorrect. All right, so again, we're going to move towards surplus in our current account. We're going to move towards a deficit in our financial account. Again, I don't mean to confuse you there, but so you can get to that answer a couple different ways from where you might. Okay, again, kind of checking your work with that chart. That's how I would operate in that case if that's what I thought maybe was the answer. All right, we've got an increased budget deficit and interest rates are constant. Which of the following is true? All right, so our budget deficit means our government's spending more money than they are bringing in tax revenue. So government spending is greater than tax revenue, greater than tax revenue, greater than tax revenue. We got three options so far. Now, assuming that when the government borrows more money, it's going to increase the demand for money, right? So here's our second demand for money, interest rate, quantity. Okay, so that's our government borrowing more money. Now, assuming that the Federal Reserve is going to try to keep this interest rate back over here, right? That we want to keep this, sorry, I'm backwards. Let me start over. To stay consistent, I'll draw my vertical supply of money there, okay? So here's our demand for money, interest rate, quantity. If you were to draw that, upward sloping line for the supply of money, that's completely fine. It's accepted. It's going to give you the same answer eventually anyway. So let's start over. Sorry. Increase in demand for money due to the federal government borrowing more. So if the interest rate is going to stay right here, okay, we also have to increase our supply of money, which means it's got to be a loose money policy or an expansionary policy. They just say increase the money supply in this particular case. They could word it a few different ways. Okay, so again, we're going to assume in this case that when the government borrows money, it does affect the interest rate in one way, shape, or form. How do we even that out? We've got to increase the supply of money. All right, let's go back to, for this question, we're going to go back to our Fisher equation. And they add some silly words. So the Fisher equation, remember, in case you didn't see the first one, we're going to change that HER into NER, nominal minus expected equals real. All right. And so it's going to give us some numbers. It says, suppose the real interest rate is equal to 7. All right. So we've got 7 equals that. And it says if the expected inflation rate is currently 3%, that it's going to ask you that nominal rate. Now it's going to throw you a curveball. It's going to say, look, due to this oil crisis in the Middle East, our inflation rate is going to move to 4%. So we're going to rewrite our equation to 4 equals 7. Now we just got to figure out what this x is. Okay, do the math. X is going to equal 11. That's how you come up with your answer. All right, moving to the next one here. Government investment in human capital likely to shift. All right, human capital is going to increase our ability to produce stuff. That's what we got to remember. So we know for sure that our aggregate supply is going to shift to the right, right? That aggregate supply curve means that's our maximum production level, okay, that we can use our resources for. If we invest in people's ability to produce stuff, it's going to move to the right. So we know it's got to be A. Got to be A. It's the only one that says aggregate supply shifts to the right. All right. In the short run, too, kind of depending on what's going on, you could tie that into aggregate demand in the way it's not going to decrease aggregate demand. It's going to increase aggregate demand because let's say we have to hire a teacher to teach kids, right? Well, that's going to obviously increase income and spending. We could tie that in there too. Lucky for this one, aggregate supply shift to the right in the long run. All right, so this is just some fact-based knowledge. Remember, CPI, all right, is that basket of goods that helps us figure out the inflation rate. Inflation, remember, is determined by, we're trying to figure out in some way, shape, or form the average level of price increase by basic goods. All right. Now, inflation in some things are going to be more heavily weighted than inflation in others. It's not asking us about that. But remember the negatives of, or I'm sorry, not the negatives, but some of the inaccuracies of consumer price index. Number one is that not everybody buys all the necessities that are going to be in there. We can substitute stuff. So if the price of, let's say, gasoline goes way up, right, that's a big cost for a lot of people. But maybe people start riding their bikes and they save money that way and actually become healthier and decrease overall eventually like healthcare costs or whatever, right? So that's one of the inaccuracies. People can substitute. People can buy in bulk. The quality of goods and services aren't necessarily always, and that's our answer, the quality of goods and services aren't necessarily always reflected, right? So, I mean, I don't know, the example that we use in our notes way back when is like the quality of like car tires, or even I would say like cell phones. You can use the same cell phone for a lot of years now. That wasn't always the case back in the flip phone world. Okay, so anyway, those are some of those inaccuracies. Remember, consumer price index really doesn't have anything to do with the interest rates, right? So that's not where the consumer price index is how interest rates are figured. All right. We do use that substitute word down here. So we got to be careful that we say, hey, we can substitute more expensive goods without being worse off. Well, that's not necessary. That's not true. Okay, we don't know how much more expensive. That's not necessarily true. Okay, so the best one is the quality is not fully reflected. Kind of a really lame answer, but that is the answer as far as. And when I say lame, that's like the boring one. Like the quality changes was one of the boring answers. All right, what's true about inflation in the short run? Well, there's some things that we know before we read through these, and I haven't read through them yet necessarily, is we know that inflation causes or is caused by lower unemployment. We also know that inflation is caused when the price of stuff increases. So, or the price of inputs increases. So, to draw our graph here, inflation is caused by increase in demand or a decrease in supply, one or the other. Okay, so let's look at what might cause that. Just before I even read the answers, let's kind of think about that. All right, so during a period of cost push, the economy's output will rise rapidly. Okay, well, we know that's not true, right? We just did cost push inflation. We drew it on here. Well, output did not move this way. All right, so we know it's not A. Option B, basic difference in cost push demand pull lies in the rate at which price level is rising. We don't know the rate at which it rises. We don't know. Okay, we don't have the slope of the lines. We can cancel that. Demand pull inflation in the economy's output will be stagnant. We just drew demand pull inflation. Our output was not stagnant. Real output increases when there is a demand pull inflation and decreases when there is cost push inflation. Hey, look at that. We did need that graph. Okay, we've got increase in demand. We've got decrease in supply. We know that to be true. Inflation start out being cost push. We know that not necessarily. Okay, we don't know that's why. We don't know that's why inflation occurs. Okay, draw that stuff out. Again, it kind of takes you a little bit longer. These aren't history questions, right? They are, conceptual questions that we've got to use some graphs and be able to practice some things. What's going to increase the money supply? All right, so we're trying to lower the interest rate. What's going to do it? I think there's been 5 questions about central bank open market operations on these 60 questions here. The central bank buys bonds on the open market. That's going to increase the money supply. Sells, makes it smaller, not doing it. Government increases taxes. Nope, that's not going to do it. Government increasing taxes is it's going to be our aggregate demand curve, right? That has nothing to do with interest rates. Decreases taxes, not going to do it. And again, these are fiscal policies. Whoops. These are fiscal policies. We can't do those. We're talking about money supply, right? The money supply is affected by monetary policy. Government decreases another fiscal policy. So you should be able to narrow it down by A and B. Okay, the government can't do anything to affect interest rates. The central bank can. The Federal Reserve can. So anyway, option A. I hope that you're able to get something out of here. I've kind of said, if you could get one more multiple choice question right out of each of these videos, that's 3 total questions, hopefully, throughout the course of it. Hopefully we are setting you up for some success. Don't hesitate to ask for, help. Hopefully you're able to not have to watch every single explanation of questions, all that good stuff. We will talk soon.